Hi, my name is Richard Landers. I am a professor of industrial organizational psychology at the University of Minnesota. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my Karma course on web scraping. My field is industrial organizational IO psychology. That's the psychology of workplace behavior. And what my research is how technology, especially the internet, artificial intelligence, games, gamification, can be used to improve employee hiring, adult learning, research methodology. I'm also an elected fellow of the Society for IO Psychology, the American Psychological Association, and the Association for Psychological Science. My interest in web scraping began probably about a decade ago as part of my interest in research methods. I used web scraping to conduct several research studies, including investigation of how work-family conflict was explored in some online forums, a study of job satisfaction using data we scraped from Glassdoor, which is a place where people rate their employers. And ultimately, all of that really led me to publish a piece that appears in Psychological Methods, where we outline both the why and how of web scraping when you're trying to understand people. There was a gap at the time in trying to have a good rationale for using web scraping when the standard approach was survey-based research. So why would you do something like web scraping? So that's what we walked about. That's what we wrote about. I think it's a really interesting and important area because to me, one of the biggest advantages of it is the fact that it democratizes access to data. Whereas traditionally, there are a lot of costs, both personnel, but also in terms of money to using a lot of the commonly accepted techniques that are used for data collection. That when we create these standards to say, well, you need to be, for example, within an organization to have access to people within organizations to meaningfully do organizational science, that seems destructive and exclusionary to me. So web scraping is a way that people without many resources, and honestly, almost no resources at all other than a computer, in many cases, can potentially get access to high quality data sets to ask some really interesting questions. So, having said that, web scraping doesn't really solve all of your data problems. It does, and it can give you access to these massive, interesting data sets, hundreds of thousands or millions of case data sets. But the downside is in navigating that complexity. So in my workshop on web scraping, we do cover both the theoretical and the practical dimensions of that problem. The first day is mostly foundational. The first half, we talk about how web scraping fits into methods alongside other approaches. Is it distinct from observational research? Is it more like traditional internet-based panel research? What are the differences, and how would I explain that to reviewers in writing a paper, for example? In the second half of that day, we work on the foundations from the technical side. What are the foundations of internet architecture? One of the big surprises in people learning web scraping is that you have to gain a pretty good familiarity with how the internet works. How are we able to get web pages in web browsers? What data are being transferred there? What information are we actually sending, and what information needs to be sent in order to get useful information out of a website? We cover all of that on that first day. After the first day, we get into the core of web scraping. So days 2 and 3 are really about what skills do you need in order to meaningfully identify some random page off of the internet and then figure out how to pull data from it. So we go through a lot of options, from the very simplest things you can actually just do in a web browser without any other tools whatsoever, to the more complex approaches that require R. So we get into R. The R code itself is not that complicated. If you've had basic introductory material in R, you shouldn't find it too difficult. And Karma usually offers a crash course in basic R. So if you have that, you should be pretty well prepared for what we do. And things are actually even easier now. We do explore a little bit how large language models like ChatGPT can actually help you with your code or help you with the scraping task itself in certain cases, depending on how complicated that task is. The point of all of that is really to make it so that when you come out of the workshop, that you're able to identify what the best tool is for any particular scraping job. So, it's pretty rare that by default, writing a massive complicated program in R should be your number one option. So we go through the simplest approaches first, and then we talk about the more complex ones. So we kind of build as we go. On the fourth day of the workshop, the last day, we spend most of that time covering APIs, which stands for Application Programming Interface. It's essentially a piece of software that a company has written, a company that owns complex data. Things like Meta has an API, Reddit has an API. These kind of social media companies traditionally have APIs. And basically those programs have been written to make it easier to access the data sets that those companies own. APIs offer kind of different trade-offs versus web scraping, which we cover first. We get in a lot of detail about that. APIs can give you access to far more complex and interesting data than you can get easily through web scraping, but there are other restrictions that are placed on top of it that may or may not be worth it, depending on your particular project. So we talk about that, how to use R to write code that is sent to those programs so that you can grab the data that you want. And again, a full spectrum from very, very easy to very complex approaches. Through that whole approach, you get about 25% like theory and background, about 75% applied data skills. So you can basically take that, and for many projects, it depends on the specifics, but for many projects, you can take what we cover in this workshop and immediately go out and get your million case data set. It depends a little bit, again, on exactly what you want to do, but we also have a little bit of time to talk about that. And I'm also available after the course for email questions, for people that have a specific scraping project that they're not quite sure how to tackle. And I've counseled a lot of folks on how to do that. So yeah, that's the rundown. Web scraping is I think a really great gateway skill into more advanced data science. People often start with this idea of, I just want really big data sets off the internet, and that helps them get the confidence to learn other data science skills, things like natural language processing, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, and use those to analyze these really massive, complex scraped data sets. So we'll talk a bit about your different options that you have once you have your giant data sets, your big data, how you can, we'll spend a bit of time talking about how you can develop those skills. There are some Karma courses that get at that. We have courses on text analysis, that kind of thing. But it's a much bigger world. So there's lots of different ways you could go with it. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons and challenges associated with building those skill sets, as well as a bit of focus on how do you identify when you're in over your head, when you do need to go out and get some technical advice. But there's quite a lot you can do before you get to that point, even with only light R skills. So yeah, that's pretty much it. In general, web scraping is just a lot of fun. It's basically solving a series of logic puzzles in order to convince R or your web browser to give you whatever data set you want it to give you. So as long as you approach it with that kind of mentality of playing around and experimenting and engineering a good solution to a particular data problem that you're having, it's a really good time. And you can get some really cool data sets with relatively little effort, and definitely far less effort than the old days of getting an army of research assistants to go write things in Excel spreadsheets. You should never do that again once you have this. That's pretty much it. And I hope you'll join me for it.